In this video, we're going to cover how to configure BizLinker for Billquick to Xero to export expenses. First of all, let's start in BizLinker and we'll go and look at the configuration settings. So go to Settings, then Options, and then let's choose the Expenses tab. I'll go through each of the settings to explain what they are, and we might make a few changes. So we're exporting the Billquick expense log to purchases within Xero. If we come across an expense in Billquick that is linked to a vendor bill, we have some options there. Are we going to export it anyway? Are we going to export it with a warning, or are we going to skip it? So for the moment, I'll just put it on Export. Expense GL mapping. So with an expense entry in Billquick, if we want to record that in Xero, we need to tell Xero which expense account to use for that expense. And there's a couple of ways of doing this with BizLinker. We've chosen by expense account, which means that each expense code in Billquick will be linked to a Xero expense account. Alternatively, we can just put them all into a single account and we'll set up that as a default. But let's just keep it as by expense account. Default expense account, expenses. So here we get to choose from the Xero accounts what will be our default expense account. And we've already imported these, so we'll just choose, say, 467 as our default. How will we handle GST on the expenses? Again, we've got a few different choices. We can say we're not going to worry about using GST at all. We'll just send the cost straight through. We could say we'll use one of the flags on the expense log to designate which ones have GST. We could say we'll use the purchase tax on the Billquick expense line to designate GST. We could use the project main expense tax, or we could use the tax 1 on the expense log. Let's just choose project main expense tax. So this means if your project is set up to have GST on expenses, it will be assumed to have that GST when we export to Xero. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is to import all the Xero accounts into Billquick. And to do that, in BizLinker we just go to the Accounts tab and then click Import Accounts. It will overwrite any accounts that are in there, so just confirm that, and then in a few moments it will import all the accounts that it needs in Billquick. Okay, so back in Billquick, let's look at our expense codes. So to reach that, it's the View menu and Expense Codes. And here's the code we're going to use for our expense log entry, PT, which is public transport. And it's been assigned to an expense account, which I can just pull out of the list, which we've now imported. If these fields aren't appearing, there's a field chooser. Just make sure that the fields are selected in the field chooser. I've also got custom fields set up here, operation and branch, and these will be our tracking categories. So we can set up expense codes to use Xero tracking categories. To relabel those like that, again, we use the custom labels feature in Billquick. So that's settings, custom labels. This time we're in the expense code area, and I've chosen custom 5 as operation, field type text, and custom 6 as branched, field type text. Then they will show up with those captions there, and I can enter the values in there. If you have Billquick Enterprise version, you can go one step further and actually put the tracking categories in a drop-down list in the expense code setup. So now we're ready to go. If we use that particular expense code in an expense log entry, it will automatically copy those tracking categories and that account into the expense entry. That makes it a bit simpler for us, transferring that to Xero. Okay, with the line description, we can enter a series of tokens, and BizLinker will turn that into a full description in Xero purchase entry. And so if I just hover here, I can get a full list. You can see PID is project ID, DS is the description, and ED there is the expense code description, and there's a few others as well. If we come across a new supplier in our export, if we check that box there, it will automatically do a supplier export. If I check this box here, subtract purchase tax, it will just send the GST free portion to Xero, and Xero will add on GST according to the expense code. Up the top right, when the expense is created in Xero, what status should it have? We can have draft, submitted, or authorized. We'll just leave it as, let's just change that to submitted. We can set a default due date for this purchase, and we'll just put some options in here for 0 days, 7, 14, 21, 30, 45, or 60. I'll just choose 7 days here, and that will calculate a due date within Xero. On the approval status of the Billquick expense entry, we can say we don't care. We can just take all expenses, or just the approved expenses, or just the unapproved expenses. But let's just take the approved only. Same idea with the reimbursable flag in Billquick. Here I'm just choosing, I only want to export reimbursable only. I could also choose all expenses and not reimbursable only. We have a feature here that will generate a bill number for expenses. So expenses in Billquick don't have a bill number like vendor bills do, but we can create a sequence, and that will get created and written back to Billquick after the expense entry, and that same number will show up in Xero. So that's a great feature to help align the expenses in Billquick to expenses in Xero, because they will both have the same auto-generated number. So this number can be whatever you want, and inside the curly brackets there, that is a incrementing code, very similar to the way that works for other IDs generated in Billquick. And that number will show up in a custom field on the expense log. Here we're choosing custom field 3, and we can also choose to record the actual sync time as well in another field. Custom field 4 is what we're going to choose here. If I want neither of those features, I can just choose none, but let's leave that as custom 4. That's all the expenses settings that we need to set up there. We also have category tracking that we can use. So in Xero, we've already loaded our 2 tracking categories, and in the case of expenses, we might say we have many choices about how to assign the tracking category. Let's choose expense log. We're already using 3 and 4. Let's choose expense log 5 and expense log 6. So category 1 will use the value that's in expense log 5. Category 2 will use the value in expense log 6. And if we want to check our tracking category, so our first one is operation, and that's the list there, and our second one is branch, and that's the list there. So these are just copies of the information that's already been set up in Xero. Okay, that completes our configuration. Let's go now and set Billquick up. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is to import all the Xero accounts into Billquick. And to do that, in BizLinker we just go to the Accounts tab and then click Import Accounts. It will overwrite any accounts that are in there, so just confirm that, and then in a few moments it will import all the accounts that it needs in Billquick. Okay, so back in Billquick, let's look at our expense codes. So to reach that, it's the View menu and Expense Codes. And here's a code we're going to use for our expense log entry, PT, which is public transport. And it's been assigned to an expense account, which I can just pull out of the list, which we've now imported. If these fields aren't appearing, there's a field chooser. Just make sure that the field are selected in the field chooser. I've also got custom fields set up here, operation and branch, and these will be our tracking categories. So we can set up expense codes to use Xero tracking categories. To relabel those like that, again, we use the custom labels feature in Billquick. So that's settings, custom labels. This time we're in the expense code area, and I've chosen custom 5 as operation, field type text, and custom 6 as branch, field type text. Then they will show up with those captions there, and I can enter the values in there. If you have Billquick Enterprise version, you can go one step further and actually put the tracking categories in a drop-down list in the expense code setup. So now we're ready to go. If we use that particular expense code in an expense log entry, it will automatically copy those tracking categories and that account into the expense entry. That makes it a bit simpler for us, transferring that to Xero. Okay, so here we are in Billquick. Let's take a look at our expense entry custom fields. So Billquick has a feature called custom fields where you can set certain fields in different parts of the system for your own purposes, and we'll use that. So we'll go to settings in Billquick, then custom labels, and then we'll go to expense log. In custom 3 here, remember that was the field we chose for the bill number. So I've already put in there Xero bill, and it's a text field. Custom 4, if we type in sync time, custom 5, this is where our first tracking category was, and we've called that operation. It's the name of our first tracking category. It's also a text field. And custom 6 is our second tracking category, which is called branch. And I'll just save that now. Close that. And then when we come back into the expense log, we'll see that those custom fields are available for us. If I go to the field chooser, you see custom 1 and custom 2 there, but then the others have been renamed. So if we look for them, there's our Xero bill number there, there's our sync time field there, our operation and our branch have all been selected. And then once they've been selected, we can reorder these as we wish. So we've got Xero bill, sync time, operation and branch. Okay, let's go ahead and enter a couple of expenses. So I'll just choose today's date. I have the job set up for this purpose. Choose an expense code. I'm just going to choose, say, public transport, and one of those, and I've bought a ticket there for, let's say, $5. Now, because this has been set up with a purchase tax in Billquick, and I have the cost included checkbox on there, that purchase tax has been removed, and the amount $4.55 added there. So in this video we're using a New Zealand database, so I'll change that purchase tax, and it's just taken a little more off there. The expense code that will be used has been now selected as travel there, and you can also see that if we have set up the tracking categories at the expense code level, they'll come through automatically into this expense entry. Perfect. Okay, so we now have an expense there. It's already been approved, and I'll make it also reimbursable because we said that we only wanted approved and reimbursable expenses. Let's import this now in BizLinker. So back in BizLinker, I'll just choose my employee, choose my date range. It's the 17th. I check the box in both cases there to apply those filters. We're just being told here, just to remind us that we're using approved only and reimbursable only. So when I export the expenses, I'm expecting just to have one expense. And that has now exported that successfully to Xero. So let's have a look at how that looks inside Xero. So here we are inside Xero, and it's looking pretty good. We can see on our accounts and purchases area where there's one $5 purchase waiting approved, because remember we said to set the approval status to be submitted on sending this expense to Xero. So let's go into this category here. And sure enough, there's one expense waiting for us. It's being given a number, BQ2XERO, and that should match what we have in our expense log. And let's go and look at the detail. So in the detail, we see the name of the employee from Billquick, the expense date, the due date's been calculated as 7 days. The reference that we've created is BQ2XERO. The description that we've created is our project ID, followed by the expense code and the expense description. The quantity of 1, our less GST price of $4.35 in the travel expenses account. Xero is adding on the 15% GST, and we've also recorded our two tracking categories, Napier and Coastal, and that's a total of $5. So that's come across perfectly from Billquick through BizLinker. If we go back now to view Billquick, we can see the bill number and the sync time will have come through. So in Billquick, if I just refresh my expense log, sure enough, there's our BQ2XERO. That's the record linking symbol there, showing that's been linked. And there's our sync time, has been also written back to Billquick by BizLinker. And that concludes our video on exporting expenses from Billquick to Xero using BizLinker from Lobster Software. Thank you for watching.